photographer specializing in images and stories about wildlife of high latitudes and high altitudes of the Rocky Mountains and Alaska, as well as the stunning landscapes during the day and night in those vast locations. With more than 800 bylined articles and photo credits, Dawn's text and photography have appeared in numerous regional and national publications, including Colorado Life, Colorado Outdoors, Wyoming Wildlife, Outdoor Photographer, Motorhome Magazine, Nature's Best Photography, and many others. In addition to her editorial work, Dawn leads multiple workshops each year in North and South America to photograph wildlife, such as brown bears in Alaska, birds and primates of Peru, and the nature of Nome, Alaska. She also leads photo tours in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. She served 2 terms as president of the North American Nature Photography Association and has been the co-host of the Nature Photographer podcast. She's going to tell us all about her work and about birding in the area. And she also has a website, dawnwilsonphotography.com, that she'll share at the end so that you all can see more of her work and see more of what she does. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Dawn, and I will ask James from IT, I think you're who on, if you can turn on closed captioning, that would be great, if possible. But yes, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dawn at this point.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight on this cold and snowy night. I know I saw -5 today here in Estes, so I don't know if it's quite that cold in Broomfield, but it's a chilly one out there. So it goes along well. We are going to talk today about birds in Colorado in the wintertime. So let me just get this launched there. So Maddie, does that look like it's okay?
Yes, that looks great.
Perfect. All right, let's jump right in.
Before you get started, can I just say, I know there's going to be a lot of questions probably. And so if people have questions, feel free to put it into the Q&A and we will save those and have Dawn answer questions at the end of the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Tara.
All right, very good. Well, let me give you a little bit of background in addition to what Maddie's already provided. I did grow up in New Jersey, but I've been out here in Colorado since 2002. After finishing a graduate school program, I knew that I had wanted, like most people, wanted to move out to Colorado. I had visited prior to that and fell in love with it and knew that was where I wanted to be. So I've been out here ever since, and I've been up here in Estes Park since about 2016. And as Maddie mentioned, I do lead tours in Rocky Mountain National Park, but I explore all over the place. But I did spend about 20 years in corporate marketing before taking the plunge into a full-time career as a nature photographer and writer, travel writer, outdoor writer. I've published a book about Estes Park. I've written for the Estes Park Trail Gazette, as well as some other newspapers in Colorado. So I stay pretty busy. I do a lot of writing. And as I mentioned, I live here in Estes, and I just do a ton of traveling and hiking, a lot of exploring. And there was a time where I actually traveled for almost a year and a half in an RV, photographing wildlife all over the US. So these are some of the articles. You may be familiar with some of these if you've come across them in Colorado Life and Colorado Outdoors. Usually my articles are about the outdoor world, whether it's wildlife or fishing or working in the outdoors, but that's primarily my subjects. So let's talk tonight about birds in Colorado. I spent some time today, about an hour and a half, 2 hours, photographing some American dippers out on the frozen Big Thompson River here through Estes Park. It's always a wonderful time of year to go out and get photographs. I know a lot of people always think it's cold, I'm not going to go out, there's nothing to photograph, and there's actually quite a bit, and it's a beautiful time of year to take advantage of those snowy scenes, as well as some of the birds that we don't see here in other times of the year. So Colorado is actually considered a mild climate for some birds that live farther north. So that weather actually pushes them farther south, where they can find open water and they can find food to survive the cold winter climates in their summer habitats. So in Colorado, we get a lot of ducks. The bald eagle population increases in the wintertime, and we actually get some Arctic songbirds as well. Over the years, I've seen common redpolls. So those are actually redpolls now. They merged the two species of the common redpoll and the hoary redpoll together. I've seen snowy owls here. I've seen Bohemian waxwings, which typically go spend most of the winter in Alaska. So you never know what might come down. We're going to talk about some of those different birds. So in addition to migrating from farther north from places like Alaska and Canada, a lot of birds in Colorado don't necessarily migrate per se, but they actually migrate out of the mountains and into lower elevations where they can find food. So for example, I mentioned I photographed some American dippers today, and those birds actually spend a lot of time in the mountain streams and rivers. And because those get snow covered in the wintertime, they actually come down to lower elevations where there is open water. Mountain bluebirds are another example of that. You'll see them in the mountain valleys in the summertime and in the spring, but in the wintertime, they'll actually come down to lower elevations in the foothills and on the plains. So we should be seeing here in Estes Park, usually our very first mountain bluebird shows up about the 3rd or 4th week of February. So the males will show up first and then the females show up about 3 weeks later. But we should start seeing those guys anytime now. So I'm always looking forward to that in the wintertime. And then there are some birds in Colorado that just don't migrate at all. There are, like the white-tailed ptarmigan, really don't migrate out of their high country habitat where they basically live the year round. The only thing they may do is actually move a little bit closer to where the willow bushes are. They'll use those bushes for wind protection, where they might be out on more of the talus slopes in the summertime, but they're primarily up above tree line the whole year round. Another bird that I still continue to see in the wintertime here in the mountains is the Steller's jay, which is a beautiful bird in the winter. That beautiful, like just gorgeous, deep blue color, and their black feathers against white scenes is really, really pretty. So as I mentioned, we get a lot of bald eagles in the wintertime that visit Colorado. Throughout the year, we have about 300 resident pairs of bald eagles that actually nest and raise their young here. But in the wintertime, we actually get about 1,000 additional bald eagles that come to Colorado to just spend the winter here for a few months and take advantage of some of the open water. If you're ever looking for bald eagles in the wintertime, they start showing up about November and they stay through about the end of February. So we're kind of getting to the end of that season for the bald eagles. But you always want to look for them around places where there's open water, where they can continue to fish for their favorite food, which is fish. But they always tend to concentrate around places that have either aerators or dams. And then that moving water helps to keep the water helps to keep ice from forming on the water. So some winters we do see eruptions in Colorado. An eruption is basically an influx of birds that we don't normally see in a place. So for example, this year I just got back from Minnesota, and in Minnesota they're actually having an owl eruption this winter where they're seeing boreal owls and great gray owls, a lot of different snowy owls, a lot of different owl species, or they see those owl species in the winter times, but it's usually pretty sporadic. Where this year they're actually seeing an influx of higher numbers of them. And usually that means that there's limited food sources in their typical winter territories a little bit farther north. As I mentioned, we have seen sometimes when those owl eruptions happen, they do come as far south as Colorado. We have had snowy owls down here. I don't know of any great gray owls being in Colorado, but in the wintertime, we'll see short-eared owls, long-eared owls, and then the snowy owls. Those are great birds to look for in winter. And then a couple of years ago, we actually had an eruption of Bohemian waxwings. That's what this photo is of just dozens of waxwings sitting up on a tree in Fort Collins. But so these are those birds that tend to cause a flurry of activity with birders who are like, oh, I've never seen a bird like that typically spends its winters more up in places like Alaska or in Canada. And then we had, like I said, it was just a couple of years ago. It was a fun time to actually follow. You get this report of like 15, 20, 30 waxwings appearing usually you'll find them around some of the cherry trees that still have berries on them. You know, the crabapple trees and the cherry trees that are used in landscaping around some of the Denver areas or along the Front Range. And they would start showing up in like a couple dozen, and within a day or two there would be 100, 200, 300, and they would just decimate all the berries on these trees, and then they would kind of disappear and go off to find another area to decimate. So it was a fun time to actually try to figure out where they were and find them. So that was a pretty special event. To look for birds in Colorado, these are some of the places that I'm always kind of searching out for birds. They are pretty accessible for birders or photographers. Some of the state parks that I visit are Cherry Creek State Park, St. Vrain in Longmont, Bar Lake over in Brighton, Colorado State Forest State Park, which is up towards Walden. John Martin Reservoir is actually, I just checked yesterday, and they get a ton of snow geese that migrate through there. The snow geese are actually moving north right now. They're one of the early birds to migrate north. And about a week ago, they were recording anywhere from 10 to 30,000 snow geese down at that reservoir in that area. It looks like they may be moving on a little bit. The numbers are kind of coming back down now. But Jackson Lake is also another place that gets a lot of snow geese this time of year. So those are two places that if you've never seen a snow goose or a large flock of snow geese, those are great places to go check for them. Look for public feeders or set up your own feeder in your backyard. For example, Red Rocks Trading Post down in near, not Evergreen, but down in that area. That's a great spot that actually they stock their feeders in the back. And so that attracts a lot of birds that are trying to survive the winter. But you can set up your own feeders in the backyard. I know I've had feeders out on my decks, and it's always a lot of fun to see the pine siskins, the Cassin's finch, the house finches, all these birds that look really, really pretty on a snowy landscape. Oh, I have a sneeze coming on. I have to apologize. National wildlife refuges are also really good. Monte Vista down in the San Luis Valley, Arapahoe National Wildlife Refuge up by Walden, and two ponds in Arvada. Not so much for a ton of birds in the wintertime, but this time of year they do have owls down there, great horned owls. You might be able to find them down there. I know they do have a couple of places where they nest in the area. So these photos show you a Steller's jay on the left-hand side and a long-eared owl on the right-hand side. Both were photographed in state parks. Open water is another great spot to look for some of the ducks that come into Colorado in the wintertime. We get a lot of golden eyes. We have redheads, or a lot of redheads this winter. I saw several places over in Boulder where they had a lot of redhead ducks, but we get a lot of the ones that come down farther south to take advantage of some open water, and then they go back up to Canada and Alaska where they nest for the summer season. But places that I look for, like along the Big Thompson River between Loveland and Estes Park, the South Platte River or Clear Creek. Clear Creek runs through places like Wheat Ridge and Lakewood, and there are a couple of parks along Clear Creek. There's actually a green belt that runs along Clear Creek. That can be a great spot to look for some of the ducks that are down here in the wintertime. And then also find some ponds or lakes that have aerators. So places that I know of are Prospect Park, Kettering Park, both Prospect Park's down in Wheat Ridge, Kettering Park is over in Littleton, and then up here in Estes Park, Coffee on the Rocks has an aerator that attracts a lot of mallard ducks. They like that pond. I don't know why the other species of ducks do not go to that pond. It always seems to only have mallard ducks. But I know here in Estes Park on Lake Estes, because there is a power plant there and there's a river that runs through that feeds Lake Estes, there's a lot of open water here in town for ducks. So we actually do get we get Barrow's golden eyes, common golden eyes. I've seen redheads up here. I've seen greater and lesser scalps up here in the wintertime. So again, great spots to take a look for some of the migrating ducks that spend the winters here. This is a photo of snow geese down by John Martin Reservoir. So the geese will actually go on the reservoir to roost for the night. And then during the day, they go out into the cornfields around the lake there to take advantage of some of the abundant food sources. But again, I love photographing these birds with the combination of a little bit of snow falling. You get a white bird on a white scene. It's a really, really pretty opportunity for photography. So to find out where some of the birds are located, I recommend signing up for the Rare Bird Alert through eBird. You'll get a daily email from them. Basically, it's a collection of all the reports that are coming in from other birders from the past day. And so it can give you an indication of like when are the snow geese showing up, or did we have some waxwings that showed up, or where are some of the ducks? I will say that a lot of the owl species have been pulled off of those bird alerts just because of the abundance of people that have kind of flocked into places where owls are. So to protect the birds, a lot of owl species are no longer being reported on there, but it's still really good for some of the other things. I did look at that list yesterday, and there surprisingly was only like 10 different species of birds and nothing super, super unusual. But it was a very short list. But as we get into the spring migration, so as we get into March and April and May, late April, early May is when we peak for spring migration here in Colorado. That list will have easily 100 different species of birds on it, or 100 different sightings of birds on it. So it can be a really helpful, as long as you're good with the daily email that you get. Keep in mind too that when somebody reports seeing a bird on eBird, if you're a birder, that can be a lot easier to spot it. But if you're a photographer, keep in mind that those birds may not be terribly close. So if you go out looking for a particular species of bird, it may be a little bit farther than what can be accommodated by even a long lens. But it's still always fun to kind of add new birds to your life list. And wintertime is a great time to do that, just because of the birds that take advantage of our pretty mild climate here in Colorado in the wintertime. So if you're looking to do some traveling for birds in the wintertime, maybe trying to find someplace a little bit warmer, or add some new birds to your life list, I have a few recommendations of places that you can go to find a variety of bird species in the winter. So one place is Nebraska, along the Platte River, which runs through central Nebraska and the Kearney area. Sandhill cranes, which is what this photo is in the bottom, kind of bottom center. These are all sandhill cranes roosting along the Platte River, not between Kearney and Grand Island in Nebraska. But they're already gathering this year. I drove through there last week, and I was shocked at how many birds. I mean, they're definitely not at peak. They get about 500,000 sandhill cranes that come through that area in March. But they do start arriving in late February, and they stay there through early April. On their way up to northern nesting grounds. Another wonderful place for birding pretty much any time of year, but including in winter, is Florida. So birds down there, actually, they get a lot of birds that, like, similar to Colorado, because of the mild climate, they have a lot of birds that migrate there for the wintertime, but they also start nesting there in about March. So while here in Colorado, we're still having, our snowiest month is March, so we can still have a lot of snow and winter weather, even though the calendar has turned into spring. That can be a great time to go out to Florida when the birds start nesting and they're preening and they're courting each other. This is a roseate spoonbill at a rookery in Florida up in St. Augustine. And then this bird over here is teal that was in Orlando wetlands I think that was about April last year. Minnesota, if you can deal with the cold, Minnesota is a phenomenal place to go for, as I mentioned, for owls. They get snowy owls, great owls, boreal owls, northern hawk owls, great horned owls, barred owls. I mean, you can easily, most days we were out, we saw at least 3 species of owls, as well as other boreal birds. So you can see things like white-winged crossbills, pine grosbeaks, the red poles. They have a lot of red poles there. This year they had a lot of purple finches that were in the area. So that's a fantastic birding spot in the wintertime. And then Louisiana is another spot similar to Florida, where there are just a lot of warm temperatures. This photo up here, the black-bellied whistling duck with his breath coming up, was actually photographed not far from New Orleans, where they get hundreds of whistling ducks in a lot of the urban ponds and lakes and parks. And it's kind of funny. I had my mother-in-law we were out at one of the parks one day, and she had mentioned that, oh, these birds are so noisy. I can't get over how noisy they are. And then I showed her a couple of the photos that I have, including this one has actually been published in Audubon. She's like, I can't believe that you can see the beauty of these birds. She's like, I've always looked at them as such a nuisance, and they're not. And so it's always interesting to see birds in different locations and catch different lighting situations and different scenarios with them. This photo on the bottom left is a boreal owl that was photographed up in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago. And then other places to go. Texas is a great place. So this photo in the middle on the left is a whooping crane. It's one of the rarest or one of the most endangered birds in North America. They were down to just a few dozen pairs that remained, and they've been doing a lot of work to bring back the numbers of the whooping crane. And Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas along the Gulf Coast is actually one of those places where that was pretty instrumental in helping to bring those numbers back up. They still have a lot of work to do, but the numbers are increasing. But that's a wonderful spot to go see whooping cranes in January and February. New Mexico, down at Bosque del Apache, down about an hour south of Albuquerque in Socorro, or near Socorro, is a wonderful spot to see sandhill cranes, snow geese, ducks, as well as the other predators that kind of follow these flocks of birds around. But this is a photograph in the bottom right of what that looks like down at Bosque. Beautiful light down there. Temperatures tend to be, kind of like 30s, maybe low 40s. Every once in a while it dips below freezing. So it's pretty mild in comparison to what we have, or maybe what Minnesota has, but they get they get thousands of sandhill cranes and snow geese down there. And combined with that beautiful light, it's a wonderful spot for photography. And another place that I've gone in the wintertime that I like to get to photograph birds is Utah. So if you go out to the Great Salt Lake area, there are a couple of state wildlife areas. There's a state park, Antelope Island State Park, and national wildlife refuges like Bear River, all around the Great Salt Lake area, where you can actually find a lot of birds in the wintertime there. And that's what this photo is in the upper right. That's some coots along some frozen water at a state wildlife area near Salt Lake City. So as we enter migration season, I wanted to kind of bring up some points about things that we can do to help birds along the way. Snow geese, sandhill cranes, and ducks have already started migrating north. So we should start seeing some increase in numbers in the next few weeks, and start seeing some new species showing up that haven't been here for a few months. Ideally, we want to remember to turn lights off after 10 p.m. to help birds migrate. Most birds migrate at night, so the light actually throws off their signals for where they need to go. So they tend to, it can be pretty detrimental to them. So research has shown that actually turning lights off at night, if we can get more lights turned off, and that includes not just homes, but office buildings, if you have any insight or influence on, buildings or anything like that, that can always help those birds as they're migrating through. And you can provide bird feeders where it is safe to help birds on a migration. Right now, there's a big problem with bird flu or avian flu. So helping or making birds congregate in one area is something to consider. But the feed can also help birds as they're on their migration north. And then you want to prevent birds from hitting glass windows by putting things like clings or tempera paint or hanging string, something to kind of distract from that reflective glass that to a bird can actually look like it's open territory, and they fly into that, and that can actually injure them. So if you'd like to do some photography for birds, especially as we get into this migration season, you want to make sure that you're understanding their behavior. Where do you find ducks? Like, for example, I know American dippers, which I enjoy photographing, they actually feed, they're the only aquatic songbird, and I know they like running water where they can stand on rocks and dive into the water to pull little midges and little insects out from under the rocks. So they tend to not like flat water, they like running water. So I know that's some place to look for them. And so the more that you can understand the behavior of certain species of birds and their unique behaviors, that will help you actually improve your photography by understanding where to go, when to be there, and where to anticipate some of that activity that can make interesting photos. So, for example, for bald eagles, they actually will poop before they fly. So if you want a flight shot and they poo, be ready to get that flight shot. I will say that it doesn't, just because they poo doesn't mean they will fly, but they always poo before they fly. So you have a better chance of capturing that photograph. Same thing with the sandhill crane. Before cranes take off, they actually lean forward. It's kind of like they have this, it's kind of like a takeoff formation where they actually will start to lean that real long head and neck. They'll lean forward and then they'll start running into like a takeoff pattern, kind of like an airplane, as they kind of have to go down that runway before they can actually have liftoff. Sandhill cranes have the same behavior. So if you see them leaning forward, that means that they're getting ready to do that run and fly. Think about what types of photos you want to take. Do you want a bird on a perch, or do you want birds in flight? Do you want birds feeding? Do you want birds nesting? All of those things have, certain seasonalities. They have, for example, as we get into nesting season, you can get a lot of birds in flight because you might know where a nest is. So you can get those interactions between the parents and the babies. You can get photographs of babies kind of peeking out from a nest. And you can also get flight shots as you're waiting for, if a bird goes into a nest, and as they exit, you can get flight shots as they exit the nest. And then you want to have, think about the types of photos that you already have of birds. You may not want to necessarily repeat a lot of those things. Like, for example, birds sitting on wires or birds sitting on perches, unless there's some really interesting dramatic light or maybe a really pretty sunrise or sunset in the sky behind the bird. You don't need to repeat a lot of those types of photographs. Think about opportunities for controlled setting. There are some rehabilitation facilities along the Front Range that do fundraisers, and they have captive birds that do educational programs, and they'll do photo sessions with them as a fundraiser to help them keep those birds fed and healthy. One in particular is Hawk Quest, which is based out of the Denver area, I believe. But I know sometimes they do some photo shoots, and those can be great places to not only get some really unique photographs of birds that you may not be able to get close to at other times, but it's also great for practicing photography. Behavior is still important to capture those right photos. And then, as I mentioned, think about that bird on a perch photo versus what other things can you photograph. You want to photograph birds in flight. You want to try to capture portraits, different types of behavior. And don't forget about interacting with the handler. Like I do a lot of writing and publishing. So I always want to make sure I'm capturing that full story, not just the photos of the birds. So in the wild, it really is a lot about eating and mating. That's basically, birds, like all animals, they have to stay healthy. If they're not healthy, they can't mate. And if they're not mating, they're not maintaining the population or increasing the population of that species. So they really need to find the food. And in wintertime, when food is scarce, that's one of the best places to go look for birds. That was why I had mentioned earlier in the presentation about using bird feeders. If there's feeders, places that where there are feeders, that can be a great spot to just sit and wait. Any place where there's seeds or other random feeding opportunities, keep those locations in mind. And then other activities. So, feeding their young, bringing in nest material. Right now, bald eagles and great horned owls are nesting. Great horned owls usually they don't build their own nest. They actually use the nest of that another bird has used, or will use a cavity like in a broken cottonwood tree. So they don't really build their nest, but the bald eagles will bring in nesting material, branches, and you'll see one of the pair will rearrange branches. They defend territories. When we were in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago, there were some great gray owls that we were photographing, and all of a sudden some crows came in. Crows they like to attack owls and eagles. So if there are a lot of crows kind of squawking and kind of flying around a tree, there's a pretty good chance that there is something else in that tree that those crows are trying to get rid of or kind of flush out. Birds that are resting, birds that are what I call impressing the ladies, but they're doing courtship displays with real flamboyant displays of tail feathers. They might be hiding in their habitat. To me, that tells a story. So I like capturing those types of photos, and preening's another thing that they like to do. We talked about bird feeders and trees with berries. So robins in particular in the wintertime will go after those crabapple trees. It's kind of funny because if they eat a lot of those crab apples, those are fermented and it can actually make the birds drunk. So if they eat too many of them. But this was a Bohemian waxwing from that eruption a couple of years ago that was feeding on a crabapple tree. This bird on the left is a black-capped chickadee at the feeder over at Red Rocks Park. So I show when I'm photographing them, I don't want to see a lot of the background, but when it's a snowy scene and that snow is covering up bricks and cement and concrete, that can be a great way to make a better photograph. We talked about ponds and lakes with aerators. We also talked about moving water. This is another photograph of a mallard up here in Estes Park at that lake. I love trying to find photographs with falling snow. It just kind of adds another element, tells a little bit more about the scenario and what that bird was doing and what the conditions were. This photograph in the lower left is a golden eye down on Clear Creek near Prospect Park and Wheat Ridge. So even though it was a winter season when I photographed this bird, there's a lot of because of all the grasses and the vegetation along the edge of the river is this nice warm brown color that was actually reflected in the water. So it wasn't terribly wintry looking, but those birds are usually only here in the wintertime. And then, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, the white on white is a great thing to photograph. It just makes really, really pretty photos. So these are willow ptarmigan in the upper right-hand corner. Those are actually photographed up in Canada. That's a northern species. But it gives you a good example of, if you get that falling snow and how it adds to that element of that white on white. Snow set against a dark background can make a really nice photograph. This bird here in the lower middle is a white-tailed ptarmigan here in Colorado in the high country in the wintertime. So those birds are more of a mottled, like a gray and brown mottled color in the summer, but in winter they turn to pure white. So that's another bird that I like to photograph on the white on white. And then if you get the mountains, we have our snow-capped mountains. This is, I believe this was Mount Evans behind this bird, behind the bald eagle. Although I look at it now, it actually might have been Long's Peak and Mount Meeker, but the snow-capped mountain behind it actually frames this dark bird really, really nicely. So that, the dark bald eagle, the brown feathers of the bald eagle stand out against that white background. Some of the other places that you can look for bald eagles in particular are what I call fish kills. So when we have really frigid Arctic air blasts that come in, like what we're experiencing right now, is that sometimes if the water is thawed, it will actually kill the fish because of that almost instantaneous drop in temperature. And then the bald eagles will actually take advantage of that if the water's open, and then they will pull all those the fish out of the lake. So look for those types of opportunities around. And again, I mentioned the dams. So if like for example, up near Fort Collins, between Loveland and Fort Collins off of Interstate 25, there's Fossil Creek Reservoir. They have a dam there that you can't get terribly close to for photography, but you can, with scopes and binoculars, you can see a lot of bald eagles that like to roost there at night. So they get a lot of eagles that come in the late afternoon, where they might take advantage of some of that open water in that area. Winter roosting areas. This is another photo. This panoramic photo is a photo of Bosque del Apache down in New Mexico. It gives you an idea of what that light looks like and what that landscape. They rarely have snow down there, but they get these beautiful golden colors. But there are a lot of birds that roost there overnight and then go out into the fields during the day to feed. This photo in the bottom right are, I think it's 4 bald eagles. Yeah. So it's 4 bald eagles sitting in this tree at sunrise. So, silhouetted against that colorful sky. But bald eagles will roost in trees overnight. So that's, around open water. Those are great places to look for them. Early nesters are owls and eagles. So the great horned owls are nesting right now. The bald eagles are nesting right now. Both will have their offspring. The eggs will hatch usually about early April, March, early April. And then it'll take a couple of months before they're actually fledging fledging out from the nest. And then in the spring, well, what would be called spring on the calendar, it's actually still winter time in many areas, is the sage grouse. So they actually, in late, the second half of March, all through April, and sometimes into early May, will go through their ornate mating and courtship displays. This is one of the males that go through this booming dancing process, and they're a lot of fun to watch as well. Migration locations. This particular location, this is Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge, it's upper right-hand photograph, attracts a lot of ducks. You look at that landscape out in the San Luis Valley and you don't realize how much water is out there. And then all of a sudden, like a flock of ducks will take off and you're like, wow, there was a ton of ducks that I didn't see, and I didn't see all that water. So that's a really pretty valley because it's all surrounded by the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and off in the distance, some other mountain ranges. It's just a really pretty landscape down there in the springtime. And as I mentioned earlier, the Santal cranes, so these are more cranes along the Platte River in central Nebraska. We have a lot of Santal cranes that actually migrate through Colorado. Steamboat Springs area is a place where they will nest in the summertime. So you'll hear them overhead. They have this real, they call it a rattling call. It's somewhat prehistoric sounding. It's a really unique call. You'll hear them. You'll see the big flocks of them flying overhead this time of year here in Colorado. And so some of them will stay in Northwest Colorado for the summer season. In controlled settings, so again, if you happen to have an opportunity to photograph birds, through an educational program and a photo shoot, it can be a great place for practice. Sometimes zoos, I know Denver Zoo will have opportunities where you can come in. I think the next one that's done with Mike's camera is in May, but they'll have opportunities where you can come in and photograph the birds that are at their facility. And in settings where it's a controlled setting, it really gives you a good opportunity to take a photograph, look at it, and kind of adjust to what you need. And that doesn't happen very often in the wild because unfortunately, these animals don't like to take direction. They don't like to stand in the ideal place all the time. So it's up to us as a photographer and a bird watcher to kind of look at the scenario. One, make sure that we're not stressing them out, and if we can move around, try to think of different ways that you can catch the light maybe a little bit better, or maybe have a better background. So for gear, for those that are wanting to learn more about bird photography, you really do need to have long lenses, so that you don't disturb the birds. You don't have to get terribly close and approaching them. But you also want to make sure that you have good camera gear that allows you to have the ability to have fast shutter speeds. You need to have really fast shutter speeds to catch birds in flight. So the three lenses that I like to use are the 180 to 600 to 500 millimeter and 80 to 400. The 80 to 400 is really good for bigger birds. It's also good for finding birds a little bit quicker. At 600 millimeters, it can be tough that if you're actually focused out on a bird, it can be hard to get them in that frame really quickly. So that's one of the reasons I like the 180 to 600. It allows me to go a little bit wider, lock in on the bird, and then I can zoom in on it to get the tighter shot. You can also get a longer lens that you can maneuver without using a tripod. It can be a lot easier to track with birds. Too long a lens, I talked about being difficult to track with birds, and you want that high frame rate. So you want to make sure that you're setting your camera on high speed, not a single shot. Position yourself parallel to the plane of focus. When starting out in bird photography, the easiest thing to do is to have the light behind you, so it's illuminating the front of your bird. As you get more practice with photographing birds, try for those flight shots. If you're parallel to the bird, or I'm sorry, if you are perpendicular to the bird, so you're looking straight on and it flies past you, that's actually the easier shot than having a bird flying directly at you. It's a little bit harder for the camera to keep the focus locked in on a bird that's approaching you. But as a bird passes you, that can be a little bit easier to actually capture those flight shots. So that's a better way to start practicing birds in flight. You want to make sure you stay wide open so that you get faster shutter speed. So you want to be at least at 1/1000th of a second, especially that works well for larger birds. As you get into smaller birds, so for example, today I was trying to photograph the dippers, which are a smaller bird, a little bit smaller than a robin. I really need to be up at about 1500th or 2000th of a second to have that fast enough shutter speed to capture that bird in flight. Make sure you stay wide open so you have a nice soft background. Wide open means, you know, having an aperture like f4, f5.6, f6.3, and that'll give you that blurred effect like here behind this bald eagle. This is Long's Peak, but you can't necessarily see the detail of it. All you're catching is basically the glow on it at sunset, and the you can see a little bit of the snow on top of that mountain. You always want to make sure you're exposing for the brightest part of the bird. If you overexpose any of the bright spots in a photograph, you cannot bring that back in post-processing without doing some pretty extensive work on it. Set your frame rate to a high speed. And then you want to make sure that you're in what, at least on the Nikon system, is called AFC or Al Servo. And that basically means that your camera is going to continuously lock in on the focus rather than just a single point, single shot or a single point versus, you know, like if you have a portrait in a studio, that subject is not moving. So it's a lot easier to have, you know, a scenario where you are just, it's not moving. Whereas with the AFC or the Al Servo, you can actually continue to keep tracking with those moving objects. And use blinkies in the histogram, and that probably gets into another level of discussion for photography, you know, outside of an intro. But I'm happy to talk about those if you ever have questions about it. And make sure you're shooting a RAW. That allows you to have more leverage in post-processing. And when you're out photographing, because birds do move quite quickly, make sure you're familiar with the buttons and dials on the camera before you get out to the field so that you are able to change those dials and get those settings to where you need them when the bird is moving around. I do believe that photography, nature photography or wildlife photography, is half technical and half creative. I find most people tend to side on one or the other, you know, whether you're technical and you like all the tech stuff that comes into photography with the camera gear versus having, you know, more of a creative perspective and you like to take more creative photographs. But both of them really are about understanding your camera equipment and understanding the behavior of your animal subjects. You always take a test shot in the current light before the animal, before the bird does something like takes off, so that you can make sure that your exposure is proper. And then I always tell people, if they want to learn more about photographing birds and birds in flight, go out and photograph gulls and pigeons. You know, they're pretty abundant in our area any time of year. And although a lot of people may look at them and say, well, you know, that's not really a bird I want to photograph, they're actually very good subjects for photography. So for example, on the pigeon, you have this white underneath the wings, and you need to make sure you're exposing properly for that. So if you don't take that test shot and you're exposing for these darker feathers, this will be blown out, and that photograph isn't something that you can use. Same thing with gulls. Gulls have a lot of white feathers on them, so it's good for practicing exposure. And then this is a real quick lesson on aperture. So if you do close-up portraits, you can see, so my focal point on this white ibis was this eye. You can see the eye, the blue eye on this bird on the right-hand side is tack sharp. But as you get farther down the bill, even though it was photographed at f9, which is a bit of a stop down aperture, I'm losing some of that detail. It's blurring out. And if I had gone to something like an f16 or an f18, I would have more of this in focus. But that was my goal for this photograph, is I wanted just the detail of this eye. I love the blue against the red and the white. So I was really going for a particular look with this. But here you can see that here the eyes on this goldeneye, again, are they're tack sharp, but it gets a little bit softer as you get down to the front of the beak. So with birds, when you're looking directly on them, they all have beaks of some sort. So you have to think about that. Do I want all of that in focus, or do I just want a little bit more dramatic effect of just the eye being in focus? Backgrounds are extremely important. Make sure you have nice, clean backgrounds. The wider your aperture and the farther away your subject is from the background, the more you'll have this nice, soft background versus a lot of busy detail behind the subject. Always capture the animal behavior. So this was a raven that was preening. It had just rained, so and the light was phenomenal. It's really nice, soft light, so that helped with all the color in the feathers there. And then always anticipate the action rather than following the action. You don't want too many butt shots of birds, so you want to be kind of ahead of the action. And then remember to capture the environment. These are so it looks like we have a golden eye down here in the lower left, and then this was an American dipper. This was along the Big Thompson River. And, it kind of shows the scene. It kind of shows that, these birds do hang out here in the wintertime when there's snow and ice and cold. So it helps to tell that story. Backgrounds are as important as a subject. So always think about what's behind your subject. Make sure you're avoiding distracting objects in the background. So big white blobs, little branches that come in that really aren't adding to the photograph. The eyes will always be drawn to the lightest and or the sharpest area in a photo. So like, for example, the mountains here are nice and soft in the distance, but the sandhill cranes are actually sharp. So that's where the eye will be drawn. Your viewer's eye, when they look at this photograph, will be drawn to those cranes. And that's what you want in a photo. Eyes for birds should be looking forward unless they're adding to the story. So for example, if these cranes are flying to me, I wouldn't see the length of the bird or the wings or anything. But because they're flying past me, that's okay that they are looking to the left. And then always make sure that you don't have a lot of space behind your subject, that when the eyes are looking into the frame, that there is space, especially for a moving bird, that there's space to kind of go into that frame. Behavior is important, but make sure they're telling that whole story. These are two bald eagles. This was a pair of bald eagles that unfortunately no longer are around, but they were really, really tolerant of people, and they used to sit really close to the road, not far from their nest, and they could be, oh my gosh, that female was always screaming at the male. They had quite a lot of interactions. It was a lot of fun to watch them for a few years. Light is always important with nature photography, and it's no different with bird photography. So morning and late afternoon are not only when the light's the best, so those are those golden hours, the first hour, about a half hour before sunrise to about an hour after sunrise. And then the reverse for sunset is when you get the nicest light. Like today was actually really nice because we actually had all this really soft light because of the weather that was passing through. In those conditions, I do like to stay out a lot longer. But that is when most birds, not all birds, but most birds are actually most active early in the morning when they're out feeding, and late in the afternoon. I do find a lot of songbirds kind of disappear late in the afternoon. They go into their roosting and nesting areas. But birds like bald eagles and sage grouse are actually more active on those edges of the day. So I understand that there is a photo contest that I believe Maddie might be mentioning. So I wanted to give some tips about photo contests. First of all, make sure you follow the rules. That's one thing. I've been a judge for a few contests, as well as being an administrator for two different contests here that are one's based out of Colorado and another one is for Nampa. But you want to make sure you follow the rules. If it says that the file has to be a certain size, make sure the file is a certain size. If it says no watermarks, don't put a watermark on it. Those types of things will get you disqualified right off the bat, even if it's one of the best photos that have been entered. I will say avoid entering hummingbird and brown bear photos unless you have something that's super, super, super unique. You would be amazed at how many of photos of those subjects are submitted to photo contests that have animal categories. Most judges don't want to have 3 or 4 hummingbird photos in the winning images, so they usually will only select one. So that means that your photo has to be better than all the others that are being submitted. Always have clean backgrounds, avoid distractions behind your subject. So that's what, like this bald eagle, even though it's just a portrait, it's a nice soft background. There's nothing distracting back there. He's looking straight forward. Eyes are tack sharp. It's all those little technical details that can make sure your photo can get past that first round of judging. Behavior does tend to resonate better than portraits for photo contests, but that's not always an end all to be all of what may win. Make sure you're finding some dramatic light. Never over process your photographs, so don't overemphasize colors or make them unnatural looking. Don't over sharpen images, and then make sure your photos are technically accurate. So that means they have to be sharp, they have to have good resolution. You don't want to have anything that's soft or out of focus. So here's my final thought. I love this quote from Ansel Adams: if it excites me, there's a good chance it will make a good photograph. And that kind of goes along those lines that, if I see, so I'll use the American Dipper again that I was photographing today. If it's just standing there on the ice, okay, it might be, nice conditions. It might be some interesting ice. It might have nice light. But if I can get that bird capture that bird in a photograph actually doing something, coming up with a worm or a real small fish, or if I can get it midair diving into the water, that's always going to make a little bit more of an exciting photograph. If you want to learn more about bird photography, I recommend this free handbook from the North American Nature Photography Association, which is NAMPA. You can download that off of their website. And then just some information about my own business. If you'd like to learn more about photography and some of the things that I do and tours that I offer, I would recommend signing up for my mailing list. I have this ebook, Preparing for the Next Shoot, which helps you prepare some travel advice. And then this is the book that I wrote about Estes Park. That is always, it says 100 things, but it's over 200 things to do in the Estes Park area. So if you're ever up this way and looking for something unique, I would recommend picking up a copy of that. I do a night sky class with the observatory in Estes Park, and that's done during the Perseids meteor shower in August. That's always a fun time where we do a classroom lecture and then go out into the park for two different locations in the park to photograph Milky Way and the meteors. Hopefully, I can't control the weather all the time. We've had some years where the weather hasn't cooperated, but we usually have at least one of those nights where we can go out into the field. And then, as Maddie mentioned, I offer tours in Rocky Mountain National Park. Those are private tours, and then I have a lot of different photo tours and photo workshops that I offer through Creeks and Critters, which is my tour company. So I have this year I have tours coming up in the Black Hills, photograph night skies and wildlife. I have another one for brown bears in Lake Clark in July. Through NAMPA, I'm going to host a regional event in the San Juan Mountains in October for Fall Colors. And then I have a tour going to Haines in Alaska in November, and that's to photograph primarily bald eagles, but also other animals that we see in that area. I am one of the guides for Wildside Nature Tours. Through Wildside, I have Amazon Riverboat Tour in Peru and Belize for birds and monkeys. That's what these are. This was an ocellated turkey that was photographed in Belize. This is I'm drawing a blank on the name of this bird. They're all over the place, but they're actually really, really hard to photograph because they are very skittish. So they don't sit still. So this was one of the few decent photos I got of that. And then this was one of the boobies, one of the Peruvian boobies that we see on the Amazon tour. I also go up to Nome in June for not only for nesting birds, muskox, and to experience the longest day of the year. I go to Churchill, Canada to photograph polar bears in September with Wildside. And then next year, I'll go down to the Galapagos. That's another birding tour, as well as some of the reptiles that are down there. And then I guide for Women in Wildlife, and that's where we go up to Minnesota for owls. This is one of the great gray owls that we photographed this year. That was a really, really nice perch. You don't always get these nice clean perches, and this one was sitting right by the side of the road on this beautiful perch, and we were the only people around there. It was wonderful. But Glacier National Park, Churchill, I have another tour going in November, and then Bosque del Apache in December, which is where these sandhill cranes were photographed. So this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out, follow me on social media channels. And you can take a look at my website for additional information. So that's everything that I have. Do we have some questions that have come in?
Thank you, Dawn. I just want to give a round of applause for I mean, there's a lot of people logged in, and I know I really enjoyed your presentation and seeing all these photos. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and if people have other questions, please, type them in right now so we can ask Dawn. Really quickly, Dawn, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is, yes, we have a calendar contest coming up for the Broomfield Open Space Foundation. So please look for details coming up in our newsletter in the next couple of months. And so this will be a Broomfield Nature Lovers Calendar, and we'll be seeking, residents to send in their best photography of Broomfield nature, open spaces, wildlife, all of that. And so, yeah, I just want to thank Dawn again, in case anyone needs to, take off before we get to questions. And so let me ask the questions. The first one is, when geese, ducks, etc., fly in the V formation, how do they pick the leader? And when the leader gets pooped, how is the next leader picked?
So a lot of people actually used to think that the leader was always the same leader, but they actually, if you watch them, they will rotate through the leader for that exact reason, because the birds in the back are actually benefiting from the kind of the front bird breaking wind. It's kind of like, not that kind of breaking wind, but kind of breaking through. It's almost kind of like breaking a trail, right? It kind of makes it easier for the birds behind them. But that does mean that front bird is doing a little bit more work. I don't know if I've ever come across an exact reason as to how the birds pick a leader. I know with certain species, it's actually it tends to be older, more experienced animals, because they know where they're going. They're familiar with a route. I would imagine with geese and ducks, it's probably the same thing. But I don't know that specifically and definitively, but I would assume it has something to do with that.
Thank you. There's one more question and one comment. So I'll read the comment first. And this says that Dawn answered all of my questions during her talk, but this was so wonderful. So thank you, Dawn.
No, thank you, Jen.
The next question is, we are told not to feed wild animals, so why are birds accepted?
And that's the great question. There are many conversations about that exact thing. And that is something that's kind of coming up now. So there are a couple different arguments for, depending on which side of that conversation you fall on. One is that we've seen since the 1970s, we've seen about a 30% decrease in the number of birds that are in the US. So one of the reasons that the proponents say you should feed them is that it helps them in difficult times, like in winter, when they need that extra food. So if they're feeding off of corn out of a field or food off of a feeder, that helps them survive in those difficult times when there might not be a lot of food around. The flip side of the argument, however, is that it does mean that birds tend to congregate together. And when we have things like avian flu right now, it can be a bad thing for it. The other thing is, like, especially here in places like Estes Park, bird feeders can actually attract other animals to eat it. So in the summertime, we're not allowed to put feeders out. This time of year, it can actually be elk and deer that'll go after the bird feeders, and birdseed can actually cause their gastrointestinal system to actually become inflamed. So it can be bad for them. So you have to make your own decision as to, do you want to bring it in at night? Do you want to do that? Make sure you have to make sure you keep it clean. You have to make sure that the food doesn't get moldy. So there's a lot of things that you have to do if you want to feed them to make sure that it is done in the right way for the benefit of the birds.
Thank you, Jen. That was a great question. And we don't have any other questions right now. If there's one more, please type it in quickly. But I also, before we end, I want to thank the City and County of Broomfield, who is our partner on putting on our speaker series. So thank you to all of the City and County partners who are on. And we also want to thank Dawn again. And as a thank you, we are offering Dawn a donation to a charity of her choice. And Dawn has chosen the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition. And I just want to read their vision really quick. So they envision a healthy watershed that is resilient to extreme events, sustains diverse habitats for flora and fauna, and enhances the quality of life for our community. So we really thank you, Dawn, for passing that donation along to the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition and for being here with us.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
There is one more question, Dawn, if you have time.
Yeah.
And so this question is, thanks for the very useful something. I'm curious, when using a 600 millimeter lens, how close do you need to be?
So that's the benefit of the 600 is that it brings your subject in a little bit closer without having to physically get a little bit closer. It's a bit of an ambiguous question in regards to, a small bird, and I'll go back to my dippers from today. A small bird is going to fill less of that frame than something like a bald eagle. But it will allow you to, double or triple the or it'll actually 2 or 3 times compress how much closer it is than, say, if you're shooting at 200 millimeters. The other thing that I really like about some of the longer lenses is that it actually has this effect, and I won't go into the physics behind it, but it has this effect of compressing the scene. It actually, because it's zooming in, it actually makes things feel closer. So kind of like that bald eagle shot that I had with the mountains behind it, it makes those mountains feel that much closer. So even if the subject isn't terribly close, it will actually bring everything else in closer as well, and can actually make a really nice photograph that way.
Thank you. Do we have any last minute questions before we wrap up? And I'll hand it back over to Maddie now.
Great. Well, again, just to echo Tara, thank you so much, Dawn. This was really, really great. We had so many people online who were very interested in the subject. So thank you again. I also wanted to say thank you to the Broomfield Open Space Foundation and Tara for co-hosting this with us and for being here. And I wanted to give a shout out to the Broomfield Bird Club and say, I know there are a lot of you on tonight, and we really appreciate what you're doing and fostering a love for birds within our community. And we appreciate you being here. So thank you so much for everyone who contributed to this tonight. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.